Hello guys, so most Power Automate desktop flows don't fail because the automation idea is bad. They fail because nobody planned what should happen when something goes wrong. A button is not found, a pop-up appears, an Excel changes, a browser loads slowly, the server is down, and suddenly automation stops. In this video, I will show you the error handling framework I used in Power Automate Desktop to make desktop flows more reliable, easier to debug, and easier to support in real business scenarios. Hi everyone, Miguel here. I'm the founder of Pulpit, where I help companies build and maintain practical automation solutions using Microsoft Power Platform, Microsoft Dynamics 365, Azure, and Microsoft Business Application. On this channel, I share practical lessons from real automation projects, not just how to build flows, but how to build automations that can actually support real business process and business scenarios. Today, we're going to talk about error handling in Power Automate Desktop. So, in this video, I will show you the error handling framework I use in Power Automate Desktop to make desktop flows more reliable, easier to debug, and easier to support in real business scenarios. In this diagram, I have a simple error handling framework. The flow starts by initializing variables. This is very important. Before processing anything, I usually create variables to control the execution. For example, I created a variable for the currently error count, and you will see later why. Also, an output status to send updates. Also, I can create some variables to store the current step, the current transaction, or some error message. The reason I do is very simple. If something fails, I want the flow to know where it is, how many times it has already failed, and what should happen next. After initializing the variables, the flow makes a decision. If it's the first time, the second time, or even the third time running this flow. Do we already have an error? Has the error count reached the maximum number of attempts? This is why I make these attempts. If the answer is yes, the flow should not continue forever. Instead, the error count increases, and the flow decides whether it should retry and stop or continue. This is very important because one of the biggest mistakes in automation is creating infinitive retry loops. Retry logic is useful, but it must have a limit. For example, if a browser is slow, retrying may solve the problem. If a button is temporary and unavailable, retrying may solve the problem again. But if the server is down, nothing that can do at the moment can solve the problem. It's just like a matter of time. That's why I normally define the maximum number of retries. For example, I may allow the flow to retry 3 times. If the automation fails once, it tries again, fails twice, tries again. If it fails 3 times, then I want to stop the flow. Log the problem and send a clear message on output variable saying the flow was not successful. Now, if there's no error, the flow continues to process the transaction. Easy. In this example, after the decision step, the flow processes the transaction. This could be anything. This could be opening a web application, creating a record on SharePoint, downloading a file, etc. After processing the transaction, I validate the result. This is an optional part. A lot of people assume that if the action did not fail technically, then the process was successful. But that's not always true. The flow may click a button successfully, but the application may still show an error. So after the main transaction, I like to validate this result. If the validation fails, some logic applies. I treat the error and send the flow back to the error handling logic. If the validation succeeds, then the flow can send a message and end. So at a high level, this is a framework. Let's recap. Initialize variables, check error count, process transaction, validate the result. If there's an error, increase the error count and retry. If the maximum number of errors is reached, stop the flow and clear failure message. If everything works, end the flow with a success message. Now, let's look to the interesting parts. How we can implement this into Power Automate Desktop. So here you can have like a separate logic into subflows like we have here. This is like the main thing that I'm going to explain, or where the main logic is. So instead of placing everything inside the main flow, I separate the process into smaller parts. Like I said, these 3 parts. For example, I have a subflow to read input data, another subflow to process the transaction, and another subflow to validate the result. This makes the flow easier to read, maintain, and easier to debug. So at the end of each flow, you can put an output message or something like it in order to understand where the flow broke. In the main flow, I start getting the current state and time. Then I initialize my counter variable. In this example, the counter starts at 0. After that, I read the label called label starts. This label is important because it gives a controlled place where the flow can return if it needs to retry. Then I use scope on block error. This is one of the most important actions for error handling in Power Automate Desktop. You can think of it as the way to tell the flow if something inside this block fails, don't just crash, don't go to an end. It returns to the beginning of scope on block error and increase the counter. So every time an error happens, the counter increases by 1. Like we can see here with these settings. This is a part of recovery logic. So I close the browser and prepare the flow to retry again from a clear state. After that, I check the counter. If the counter is greater than a maximum number of retries, then I set the output status to something like flow failed at current date and time, and then stop the flow. That is much better than failing randomly or retrying forever. But if the counter is still below the maximum number of attempts, then I send the flow back to the beginning of the block using the label. This allows the flow to retry the process. After the error handling block, I run the subflows. First I run read input data, then I run process transaction. This is where the main business process happens in the process transaction, and then we validate result. So this is where I check the automation actually achieved the expected results with some parameters. Finally, if everything worked correctly, I see the output status to flow was successful path, etc. Now let's look at the error configuration. In Power Automate Desktop, when you configure the on-block error, you can define what happens when the error occurs. In this example, I use a variable to count the number of failures. The counter is increased every time the block fails. Then I use the exception handling mode to go back to the beginning of the block. This means that when the block fails, the automation does not stop immediately. It returns to the start of the block and tries again. But because I have a counter, I can control how many times this happens. This is the key point, and it makes support so much easier. So guys, I hope you liked the video. This wraps up the video. If you want me to dive deeply in some specific topic, let me know. Write in the comments what you prefer. If you need some support on Microsoft Power Platform or Microsoft Dynamics 365, shoot me a message and let's talk. And if this video was useful, subscribe to the channel because I will sharing more practical videos on Power Automate, Power Platform, tools of Power Platform, Microsoft Dynamics 365, and real-world business automation.